Edward Mason was halfway through his morning walk in Central Park when he saw them, two little girls in matching pink dresses, one pushing a stroller, the other clutching a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. No adults. No panic. Just silence and something far too heavy in their stillness. Edward Mason never intended to visit the park that morning. His schedule, typically planned to the minute by his personal assistant, had been cleared at the last second due to a cancelled investor meeting. The moment the cancellation came in, he felt an unusual stillness. No urgent calls, no boardrooms, no flashing headlines or market reports. Just quiet. Against every instinct he had built over decades, he decided not to fill the hour with something productive. Instead, wearing a tailored navy blue suit that clashed slightly with the casual atmosphere, he left his penthouse, stepped into his private car, and told the driver to take him somewhere peaceful. The park, he added after a pause, not even knowing which one. Just one with trees. Something still. The sun had barely risen high, casting long shadows across the paths. Leaves were beginning to shift from summer green to the first hints of gold and crimson. It was quiet, save for the occasional jogger or an elderly couple walking a dog. The air was soft, carrying the faint scent of wet grass and wind. Edward moved slowly, hands in his pockets, taking in a world he usually passed by behind tinted windows. He had just turned toward a quiet trail near the playground when something odd caught his eye. A small figure, a little girl, maybe 6, was pushing a stroller with both hands, her tiny arms straining slightly as she navigated the uneven path. Beside her, another girl, the same height and age, walked carefully while holding what looked like a baby wrapped tightly in a blue blanket. Both girls wore pale pink dresses, their blonde hair catching the morning light like gold. There were no adults nearby. No one trailing behind. No mother calling out. No father adjusting a diaper bag. Edward stopped in his tracks, his pulse hitching. Something about the image unsettled him. Children playing in the park was normal, but this wasn't playing. These girls weren't skipping or laughing. They were quiet, concentrated. Intent. He watched for a few more seconds, trying to convince himself their parents must be nearby. Maybe just out of view. But the longer he stood there, the more the truth settled in like a cold weight in his chest. They were alone. He approached slowly, not wanting to scare them, crouching slightly as he neared. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you girls okay? Are you lost? Do you need help?" The one with the baby looked up first. Her eyes were large, brown, and startlingly familiar. She didn't look frightened, only tired. She tightened her grip on the baby as if instinctively shielding him. Her sister stopped pushing the stroller and turned to face him, mirroring the same wary but composed expression. The girl with the baby answered in a quiet voice, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. "Our mom died. And our dad kicked us out." Edward blinked. For a moment, he didn't think he'd heard her right. He crouched lower, carefully, so he was eye level with them. "What did you say?" "Our mom died last week," she repeated, her voice flat, practiced. "And the man we lived with said we had to leave. He said the baby could stay, but we couldn't." Edward's breath caught. He looked from one girl to the other, then down at the sleeping baby wrapped in blue. His face was round, peaceful, only a few months old at most. The two girls stood close together, the way children do when they've learned that no one else is coming to keep them safe. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, his voice no longer steady. "Sophie," the girl said. "Sophie Raines." The name struck him like a blow. He stood up suddenly, disoriented, the world around him spinning for a split second. Sophie. That name had once been his entire world. He had loved her when he was young, so deeply it changed how he saw the sky. She had vanished from his life without a word, and he had never truly recovered from her disappearance. Over the years, he had convinced himself she had moved on. Married someone. started over. And now she was gone. Just like that. Gone. And standing before him, two girls, nearly identical, with brown eyes so much like his own, it all came rushing back in a wave of disbelief and clarity. These weren't just children in need. These were her daughters. And he already knew, without a shadow of doubt, they were also his. Edward stood frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just heard. The sounds of the park, the distant chirping of birds, the faint rhythm of joggers' footsteps, the rustling of early autumn leaves, faded into silence. All he could hear was the echo of that name, Sophie Raines. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years, not since she disappeared from his life without explanation. And now her daughters stood in front of him, one holding a baby, the other still gripping the stroller handle with both hands, as if afraid to let go of the only thing anchoring them to stability. He lowered himself slowly back to their level. The girls didn't move. They didn't cry. There was a stillness in them that didn't belong to children. It was the kind of stillness that came from too much loss too soon, the kind that hardened innocence into something more fragile than anyone could see from the outside. "I knew your mom," Edward said quietly, his voice uneven. "A long time ago. She was very important to me." The twins looked at each other again, something passing silently between them. He could see it now more clearly, the shape of their noses, the curve of their lips, the way their eyebrows lifted slightly in perfect unison. He didn't need a test to tell him what he already felt with certainty in his bones. They were his. "What are your names?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady for their sake. "I'm Lily," said the one with the stroller. "I'm Harper," added the one holding the baby. Edward nodded and looked down at the baby, asleep and unaware of the world shifting around him. "And his name?" "Ollie," Harper whispered. "Oliver. And how long have you been by yourselves?" Lily hesitated. "Since Tuesday." It was Friday. Edward swallowed hard. He couldn't ask them more, not here, not on a park bench with shadows stretching across the ground and three children who needed more than questions. He stood and pulled out his phone, dialing his driver with one hand while gently resting the other on the stroller's handle. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay? Somewhere warm. You won't be alone anymore." Lily and Harper didn't argue. They didn't ask where or why. They just nodded. That, more than anything, told him how much they had already endured. 15 minutes later, his black SUV pulled up near the park entrance. The girls climbed into the back seat without hesitation. Edward carefully lifted Oliver into a car seat, adjusting the straps with more care than confidence. He had no idea what he was doing. But he knew one thing, there was no going back. The moment he had seen them, his life had split in two, before and after. And now, every second that followed would be shaped by this moment. The ride to his penthouse was quiet. Harper leaned against the window, her hand resting protectively over Oliver's chest. Lily watched the buildings go by with wide, tired eyes. Edward sat beside them, his mind racing. How had Sophie died? Why hadn't anyone contacted him? Did she ever plan to tell him about the girls? And most haunting of all, what had her last days been like, and why had no one been there for her? They arrived at the building, and the doorman's expression flickered with surprise as he watched Edward carry the baby and escort two small girls through the marble lobby. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't owe one. Upstairs, the penthouse was immaculate as always, glass walls, sleek furniture, silence. A home built for solitude. Until now. The girls stepped inside cautiously. Harper clutched Oliver tighter. Lily took off her shoes instinctively, placing them neatly by the door. Edward called for his housekeeper and asked her to prepare the guest room with extra blankets and pillows. Then he asked for warm food, anything soft, comforting, child-friendly. He led the girls to the living room, helped them sit on the couch, and crouched in front of them again. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's going to hurt you. No one's going to take your brother. You're not alone anymore." It was Harper who finally broke. Her eyes welled up, and she whispered, "We thought we'd have to sleep in the park again." Edward reached out and gently wrapped his arms around her. She didn't resist. Lily leaned against his other shoulder, her small body trembling. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, holding them close. "I'm so sorry." And in that moment, Edward Mason, the man who had once believed his heart had no room left for vulnerability, knew that everything in his life was about to change. Not because he had to take them in, but because he already loved them. Because in their silence, in their strength, in their presence, he had found something he hadn't even known he was missing. A family. His. By the time the sun dipped beneath the Manhattan skyline, casting long golden streaks across the glass towers and rooftops, Edward's penthouse no longer felt like the untouched showroom it once was. There were now signs of life scattered throughout the space: small shoes by the door, a soft baby blanket draped over the armrest, 2 pink hairbands lying forgotten on the marble coffee table. The silence he had always treasured was now filled with the quiet movements of children, Harper softly humming as she helped Lily unpack the small plastic bag they had brought with them, and Oliver's intermittent cooing from the makeshift crib that Edward's housekeeper had arranged in the guest room. Edward stood in the doorway watching them, still trying to process what had happened over the past few hours. His world, once defined by ruthless precision and unshakable order, had shifted in an instant. Nothing about this felt logical. There had been no decision made, just instinct, a sense that this was not something he could walk away from. And now, as he watched Lily carefully fold a wrinkled t-shirt and place it in one of the drawers, he felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like something both crushing and miraculous. After the girls had eaten and Oliver had fallen asleep, Edward stepped out onto the balcony. The air was crisp, and the city shimmered below like a living, breathing entity. He leaned on the railing, phone in hand, scrolling through search results until he found what he was looking for: Sophie Raines' obituary. He hesitated before clicking the link, unsure if he was ready to confront the reality of her death. But he needed answers. The obituary was short, painfully so. Sophie Raines, age 35, passed away unexpectedly after a brief illness. Survived by 3 children. No mention of him. No mention of the life they once shared, the dreams they built and abandoned. A photo accompanied the article, Sophie holding Oliver, her face thinner than he remembered, but her eyes still full of that quiet fire. He stared at the image for a long time, his heart pounding. He remembered her laugh, the way she used to tug at his tie when she wanted his attention, how she always kept her coffee just a little too sweet. He had loved her with everything he had as a young man, and then, just like that, she had vanished. He never knew why. Never understood. Now he knew at least part of the truth. She had carried those girls inside her, raised them, protected them, and never told him. And for the first time in years, he wondered if it was fear, or pride, or something else entirely that made her leave without a word. He sat in his office late into the night, pulling files, making calls, and instructing his legal team to begin the process of emergency guardianship. The girls would not go back into the system. Oliver would not be returned to a man who had abandoned his sisters. Edward would do what he had to, no matter how complicated, no matter how public it might become. In the morning, after barely 3 hours of sleep, he walked into the kitchen to find Lily and Harper sitting at the island, swinging their legs and eating toast with peanut butter. The housekeeper had braided their hair and packed small lunches. Edward paused for a moment, watching them before stepping into the room. "Good morning," he said, trying to sound calm, though his chest tightened at the sight of them in his space like they belonged there. "Morning," Harper said, smiling shyly. "Can we go to school?" Lily asked suddenly. "We haven't gone in a long time." Edward hesitated. "We'll figure that out soon," he promised. "But first, I need to talk to someone about making sure you stay with me." Harper's smile faltered. "Will someone try to take us away?" He knelt in front of them, eye level, serious now. "No one will take you away. I won't let that happen. I promise." The girls nodded, seemingly reassured, and continued eating. He stood and poured himself a cup of coffee, realizing that this was just the beginning. There were forms to file, DNA tests to arrange, social workers to contact. But none of it scared him as much as the thought of losing them before he ever got to know them. These were his daughters. And though Sophie had never told him, perhaps she had left behind something else, something he hadn't yet seen, or understood. And in that moment, as the city came to life beneath their windows, Edward Mason, a man who had mastered every financial and strategic challenge thrown at him, realized that fatherhood was the one thing he had never prepared for, and yet, somehow, it was the only thing that finally made sense. The office was unusually quiet that morning when Edward walked in. His assistant, Vanessa, stood up the second she saw him, sensing something had shifted. He was still impeccably dressed, his blue suit crisp, shoes polished, but there was something different in the way he moved, slower, more weighted, like he was holding something fragile and invisible. He walked straight into his office without a word and closed the door behind him. Moments later, he called her in. She entered with a tablet in hand, ready to go over the usual schedule, but he waved it away. "Cancel everything for the next 3 days," he said. "Push all meetings, delay briefings. If anyone has a problem, tell them it's personal." That word, personal, coming from Edward Mason was enough to silence any argument. Vanessa blinked, surprised, but nodded. "Of course. Is there anything else you need?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes. I need the best family law attorney in the city. Today. And I need you to find someone who can handle expedited guardianship paperwork." Quietly. Once she was gone, Edward sat down at his desk, opening the sleek folder his legal team had sent over the night before. Inside were temporary custody forms, background check clearances, preliminary paperwork to establish paternity. The latter he stared at the longest. He knew what the test would say, but he also knew that having it in writing would make everything official, and indisputable. It wasn't about doubt. It was about protection. For Lily. For Harper. For Oliver, even if he wasn't biologically his. In Edward's mind, it no longer mattered. That baby had been cast aside like the girls, and now he was family, too. Later that afternoon, the children were brought to a pediatrician in a discreet clinic Edward trusted. He sat in the waiting room with them, a hand resting on Oliver's car seat while Lily and Harper fidgeted beside him, nervously swinging their legs and holding hands. When the nurse finally called their names, they looked to him instinctively, and he stood without hesitation. "We'll go together," he said, and they followed him with quiet trust that nearly broke him. The doctor confirmed what Edward had feared but expected: the girls were underweight, not dangerously, but enough to show signs of long-term neglect. Their records were incomplete, and Harper had a lingering cough likely left untreated for weeks. Oliver, while healthy for the moment, had mild signs of anemia. They need stability, proper nutrition, consistency. Most of all, they need to feel safe, the doctor said. Edward nodded silently, feeling the gravity of those words. They needed what no one had given them until now. By the time they returned to the penthouse, it was nearly evening. The lights of the city sparkled against the glass walls as if the skyline itself were exhaling after a long day. Edward watched the girls settle on the floor with a box of crayons, Harper drawing with intense focus while Lily narrated stories about the pictures she was creating. Oliver lay on a blanket nearby, gurgling softly. There was something surreal about the scene, as if the life he had once dreamed of, without even realizing it, was now unfolding in front of him. He stepped into his study, shutting the door halfway, and finally called his lawyer. The conversation was fast, clipped, efficient. Yes, he wanted to pursue full custody. Yes, he was willing to undergo every screening, every test. Yes, he had already started the DNA process. And Edward, the lawyer asked carefully, "Do you want this done publicly?" There was a long pause before he answered. "No. Not unless someone tries to take them from me. Then we go public. Then we fight." That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Lily curled under a blanket with a stuffed bear she had named after her mother, and Harper tucked in beside her with one arm protectively resting near Oliver's crib. Edward stood at the doorway of their room and watched them breathe. The housekeeper had dimmed the lights, the soft lullaby music still playing faintly. The peace in the room felt delicate, like glass. But it was real. It was theirs. He walked back to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his reflection in the window catching him by surprise. He looked older, somehow. Not tired, but changed. He thought about Sophie, and for the first time since he had heard her name spoken by her daughters, he allowed himself to really feel it, the ache, the questions, the guilt. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she raised them alone? He would never know the full answer. But he could make sure the next chapter of their lives was one she would have wanted. And so, standing there in the quiet of a home that now echoed with the soft signs of life, Edward made a silent vow. No matter how complicated it got, no matter what the law said or what battles might come, he would not abandon them. He would not be the man who stepped aside. He had already missed too much. He wouldn't miss another moment. The day the paternity test results arrived, Edward sat alone in his office, the envelope unopened in his hands. It wasn't that he questioned the outcome, he already knew what it would say, but holding that thin piece of paper felt like touching the edge of something irreversible. It would be a confirmation, yes, but also a reckoning. Proof not only of biology but of years lost, of memories that never happened, of birthdays missed and tears wiped by someone else. Still, he opened it. His name, printed neatly at the top, looked strange beside the words, biological father. Lily Mason. Harper Mason. There it was, undeniable and final. Not a theory. Not a possibility. His daughters. He stared at the page for a long time, then placed it gently on his desk, as though it were made of something breakable. The truth had weight, and now it sat in the center of his life. He remembered Sophie's eyes, her voice, the way she used to laugh when he got too serious. What had she gone through? Raising them without him. Had she hated him for not being there? Had she cried the first time one of the girls said, "Mama," without a "Dada" to follow it? He would never get to ask. That loss was permanent. He stepped out into the living room and found the girls on the floor, surrounded by puzzle pieces. Harper was humming, her tongue tucked into the corner of her mouth as she tried to fit two awkward shapes together. Lily glanced up and smiled when she saw him, her expression still cautious but warmer now. They trusted him. Not fully. Not in the way that came easily. But there was a small, growing comfort in the way they moved through the apartment, in how they no longer flinched when someone called their name, in how they had started drawing pictures and leaving them on the fridge. Most of them included 3 figures. 2 girls and a man. One had a baby, drawn as a blue oval with eyes. Edward sat down beside them and helped place a corner piece. He didn't tell them about the results. Not yet. They didn't need proof. They just needed presence. Later, while the girls napped and the apartment was silent, he pulled out the small box of Sophie's things that had been delivered by a neighbor after her passing. It contained almost nothing. A scarf. A few photographs. A tattered notebook. But tucked between the pages was a letter. His name written on the front in handwriting that hadn't changed. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened it slowly, as if time itself might shatter. The letter wasn't long. She had written it shortly after the girls were born. In it, she apologized, not for leaving, but for staying away. She said she didn't know how to ask for help when he seemed to be soaring and she was barely surviving. She had tried to reach out once, she said, but changed her mind at the last second, afraid of rejection or judgment. She ended the letter with a single line that stayed with him long after he folded the page closed: "If they find you someday, love them the way I always hoped you would love me." He didn't cry. Not then. But something inside him softened in a way that would never fully return to its original shape. He took the letter and placed it in a new drawer in his desk. One the girls could open someday, when they were ready. That evening, as he helped them get ready for bed, Lily climbed onto the couch beside him and curled up against his arm. Harper followed, resting her head on his shoulder without a word. He read them a book in a low, steady voice, and when their eyes grew heavy, he kissed the top of each of their heads. In the quiet after they had fallen asleep, Edward stood at the window, city lights stretching far beyond the glass. In that moment, he realized it wasn't just about filling in what had been missing. It was about building something new. A future that started from now. A home where the lights would never turn off because someone ran out of love. And in that stillness, with a baby sleeping down the hall and 2 daughters finally safe under his roof, Edward Mason let himself feel something he hadn't felt in decades. Not control. Not success. But belonging. And the beginning of peace. The first weekend Edward spent entirely with the children began with quiet uncertainty and ended with something closer to joy than he had felt in years. He had cleared his calendar, turned off all non-essential notifications, and told Vanessa not to forward a single call unless it was an emergency. He needed the time. Not just to adjust, but to learn, to understand who Lily and Harper were outside of their pain, to know what made them laugh, what frightened them, what kind of cereal they liked or how they liked their bedtime stories read. And he also needed to face the reality of Oliver, who had already begun to recognize him as a familiar voice, turning his head when Edward spoke and reaching out a chubby hand when he was near. None of this came naturally, but it was not foreign either. It was simply new. On Saturday morning, Edward rose early, dressed in jeans and a soft sweater instead of his usual tailored armor, and walked into the kitchen to find Lily quietly arranging bowls while Harper stood on a stool trying to reach the cereal box. The sight stopped him for a second, not because it was unusual, but because it looked so normal. These girls had made themselves at home. And yet, they were still careful, still overly helpful, still watching his every move for approval or permission. He gently took the box from Harper and poured the cereal, and for the first time, they all sat together at the kitchen island for breakfast, talking softly about nothing and everything. It was imperfect. Oliver began fussing halfway through and spit up on Edward's shoulder after his bottle. Lily spilled orange juice across the counter. Harper asked him if they were allowed to talk about their mom. And he told them they could talk about anything, anytime. They ended up in Central Park later that afternoon. Not in suits or strollers, but in sneakers and jackets, the kind of outing that passed for normal in the lives of other families. The girls fed ducks and chased bubbles from a street performer. Oliver slept in his carrier strapped to Edward's chest, his tiny breath warming the collar of Edward's coat. People walked past them and smiled without recognition. For once, Edward wasn't being seen as a businessman or a billionaire. He was just a man with children, and he found that anonymity more comforting than any private elevator or boardroom ever had. That night, after warm baths and bedtime stories, Harper pulled Edward aside in the hallway. She looked nervous, her small fingers twisting the edge of her pajama shirt. "Is it okay," she asked hesitantly, "if I call you something other than Mr. Mason?" He crouched in front of her, surprised but not unprepared. "What would you like to call me?" he asked softly. She bit her lip and looked down. "I don't know yet. But something that feels like family." His chest tightened, and he nodded. "You can call me anything that feels right, Harper. Whenever you're ready." The next morning, they baked pancakes, disastrously. The batter ended up more on the counter than in the pan, and Lily insisted on adding blueberries in the shape of hearts. Oliver banged a spoon against his high chair tray with messy delight. At one point, Edward found himself standing barefoot in the middle of his once pristine kitchen, covered in flour, laughing in a way that made his cheeks ache. It didn't feel like pretending. It didn't feel like obligation. It felt real. After the children had gone to bed Sunday night, he sat on the edge of his bed, thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The silence in the penthouse no longer stretched endlessly. It was punctuated now by footsteps, giggles, questions, soft sobs, and quiet stories. There was a rhythm to it, a fragile music he didn't want to lose. He looked at the photo of Sophie he had framed and placed on the dresser, an old picture, taken when they were young, her hair blowing across her face as she laughed at something he'd said. He whispered a thank you. Not for the pain, not for the absence, but for the gift she had unknowingly left behind. These children, their spirits, their resilience, they were her legacy, and now, they were his responsibility. He stood, turned out the light, and walked quietly down the hallway to check on them one last time. Lily and Harper slept curled together like mirror images, one hand resting on a shared stuffed animal. Oliver stirred in his crib but didn't wake. Edward leaned over and gently adjusted the blanket on his chest. For the first time in his adult life, he felt no need to control the world around him. It was enough to protect the small world within these walls. The city outside continued on, indifferent and humming. But inside that home, something extraordinary was beginning, a second chance not just at fatherhood, but at life itself. On Monday morning, Edward arrived at the courthouse in a dark gray suit, crisp and clean, but beneath the polished exterior his heart thudded with a quiet, persistent ache. This was the day everything would begin to take shape legally, when guardianship would be formalized and his role in Lily, Harper, and Oliver's lives would no longer be a matter of instinct or promise, but of law. The hearing wasn't expected to be contested. Robert, Sophie's former partner, had made no effort to claim custody of the girls after abandoning them, and since Edward's legal team had already secured temporary custody of Oliver following a court-reviewed welfare check, there was little doubt about the outcome. But Edward knew the system could be unpredictable. And more than anything, he feared someone, somewhere, would find a reason to question his right to be their father. The courtroom was small and quiet, a plain space without the drama or grandeur one might imagine from television. Just a judge, a clerk, 2 lawyers, and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Edward sat at the front, flanked by his attorney and Vanessa, who had insisted on being present even though it wasn't part of her job description. She brought along a folder of neatly organized documents, and though she didn't say much, her presence grounded him. When the judge entered, Edward stood, heart pounding. The proceedings began with a review of the facts: Sophie's death, the timeline of the children's abandonment, Edward's relationship to the family, and the paternity confirmation for Lily and Harper. The judge read through each document with deliberate calm, occasionally glancing over his glasses at Edward. Then came the most difficult part, a personal statement. Edward stood and took a breath. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but weighted with emotion, "I never had the chance to be a father to Lily and Harper until now. I didn't know about them. If I had, I would have been there every single day. What I can tell you is this: since the moment I met them, I haven't thought about anything else. Not my company, not my money, not my name. Just them. Their safety, their laughter, their futures. They're my daughters, and I intend to raise them with every ounce of care I never got the chance to give before." He paused, then added, "And Oliver may not be my biological child, but I will raise him as my own. Because he is their brother. Because he was left just like they were. And because I love him, too." The courtroom fell silent. Even the clerk stopped typing for a moment. The judge nodded slowly and said, "Thank you, Mr. Mason." A few more formalities followed. Papers were signed. Terms were read aloud. And just like that, it was done. Edward walked out into the pale afternoon sunlight with legal guardianship granted and full custody of the girls. The process to adopt Oliver would continue, but this was a beginning. Not a rescue. Not charity. A family. Back at the penthouse, the girls were waiting, dressed in their favorite outfits, their hair braided by the housekeeper. When Edward stepped through the door, they ran to him without asking anything, without knowing exactly what had happened, but sensing that it mattered. He picked them both up at once, laughing despite the wait, his eyes stinging as Harper whispered, "Are we staying forever?" He nodded, voice breaking. Forever. Later that night, after dinner and stories and baths and brushing tiny teeth, Edward sat alone in the living room with a glass of wine he didn't drink. He watched the city lights and let the quiet settle around him, not as absence, but as peace. He thought of Sophie again, wondered if she'd known how strong the girls would be, how much of her lived in them. He hoped, somehow, that she did. He got up, crossed the apartment, and checked on Oliver, who stirred but stayed asleep. Then he walked to the girls' room. On the wall above their beds, they had taped a crayon drawing. It showed a man in a suit holding hands with two girls and a baby in a sling on his chest. Above it, in wobbly letters, was written, "Our Dad." Edward sat at the edge of the bed, touched the paper gently, and exhaled. He hadn't asked for this life. But it had found him, and he wasn't letting go. Autumn faded gently into winter, and with it came a rhythm that settled into Edward's home like breath, steady, quiet, and full of warmth. The once silent penthouse had transformed entirely. There were now handprints on the lower panes of the windows, a small bookshelf filled with children's books where a wine cabinet used to be, and a schedule taped to the refrigerator with colored stickers for school pickups, playdates, pediatric checkups, and bedtime stories. Life no longer waited for Edward to control it. It moved through the rooms freely, joyfully, and for the first time in years, he let it. Lily and Harper had blossomed. They no longer flinched when someone knocked on the door, no longer whispered in hushed tones before asking questions. Harper, always slightly more cautious, had grown especially attached to Oliver and spent hours reading to him, even when he was too young to understand. Lily had taken to the piano that sat untouched in the corner of the living room, and Edward now often came home to find her pressing the keys in soft, exploratory patterns that filled the apartment with sound. Their laughter came easier now. Their sleep was deeper. They were healing. So was he. The adoption process for Oliver was nearing completion. It had required a series of court hearings, evaluations, and testimony about the conditions he had been found in, but Edward had faced every step with unwavering commitment. When the final papers arrived by courier, he opened them at the dining table while the children played in the other room. The words were simple, almost clinical, petition granted, but to Edward, they felt like a full circle closing. He folded the paper, slipped it into a file with the girls' custody documents, and placed them in a new safe he'd installed in the closet, one that no longer held bonds or contracts, but his children's futures. Later that evening, after dinner, Edward called the children into the living room and sat with them on the rug. Oliver crawled into his lap instinctively, grabbing at the cuff of his shirt. Harper and Lily leaned close. He explained gently, slowly, that today was special, that as of now, no one could ever take them away from each other. That they were his, in every way that mattered. The girls didn't cheer. They didn't cry. Instead, they smiled in that quiet, powerful way that only children who had once feared everything being taken away could understand. Harper crawled into his arms, Lily wrapped herself around his side, and they sat like that until the lights dimmed and the house fell into its nighttime hush. In the days that followed, Edward noticed how different everything felt, not just the children, but himself. He had always believed he was made for control, for building things, managing risk, staying several steps ahead. But fatherhood was none of that. It was unpredictable. Messy. Humbling. And it was, to his surprise, the most extraordinary thing he had ever done. He stopped checking his emails past 7. He started walking Lily to school when he had time, taking Harper to her reading circle on Saturdays, and he began narrating Oliver's daily milestones to the girls as if they were the most important updates in the world. Because they were. On a snow-covered morning in early December, the four of them walked together through the city to a winter festival. Edward held Oliver against his chest inside a carrier, Harper clutched his left hand, and Lily skipped ahead, pointing at every glowing light and tree they passed. There were carolers, warm cocoa, and a carousel where Edward rode with both girls, laughing like he hadn't in decades. A stranger offered to take their photo, and Edward hesitated for a moment before nodding. The picture was candid, Harper hugging Oliver, Lily leaning against Edward's shoulder, and him smiling, really smiling, not for the camera, but because there was nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. That night, the framed photo sat on his desk beside the only other photo he had ever kept there, one of Sophie, taken years ago, long before life became so complicated. He looked between the two pictures and felt not the ache of loss, but the quiet weight of gratitude. She had given him more than he ever knew. Not just memories, but a family. Not just heartbreak, but hope. Before bed, Harper finally whispered the word she'd been holding inside for weeks. "Dad," she said softly, as she hugged him goodnight. "Thank you." He hugged her tighter. "I should be the one thanking you." And after he tucked them in, after the lights went off and the city glittered beyond the windows, Edward Mason stood in the hallway, the sound of his children breathing gently behind closed doors, and realized that love, real love, had found him not in success, not in wealth, not in control, but in three small souls who had once been lost, just like he had. And now, none of them were lost anymore. They were home. Together. Always. The ending of this story holds a quiet, lasting power. It doesn't rely on spectacle or dramatic twists, instead, it offers something far more profound, emotional truth. Edward doesn't become a hero in the traditional sense, he becomes something more important, a present, committed father. His transformation isn't sudden or perfect, but gradual, rooted in real choices, real pain, and the courage to accept love in its most unpolished form. The beauty of the ending is in its realism. The children are not magically healed by comfort. They carry scars. But they laugh, they grow, and they trust again. And Edward, once defined by his control and isolation, learns to surrender, to the mess, the responsibility, the joy of everyday life. This isn't just a story about family, it's about repair. About what happens when people, broken in different ways, find each other and choose not to run. The final image, Edward in the hallway, listening to the soft breath of sleeping children, isn't loud. But it says everything. Love, finally, has somewhere to live. And it's not perfect. But it's real. And that makes it unforgettable.